Introducing Recorded Content, a podcast for small, scrappy B2B marketing teams who want to get the most out of podcasting. In each episode, we capture stories from industry experts and podcasters. Listen in and uncover what it takes to launch, run, and grow a successful B2B podcast. Check out and subscribe to the show on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you listen to your favorite shows. Let's jump in.
Hey, this is Justin Brown. I'm the co-founder of Motion and your host for this episode of Recorded Content. Recorded Content is brought to you by Motion, a done-for-you podcast agency for small, scrappy B2B tech marketers. Today, I have Sarah Strid and Joe Michalowski on the show. Sarah and Joe spearhead marketing at Mosaic and run their podcast, The Roll Forward. When we first started working together, Sarah and Joe convinced their COO and co-founder to be the host of their podcast. His name is also Joe, so we'll refer to him as Joe G for this episode. Joe G was a great host, but is also, a busy co-founder of a tech company. Getting him to write his own scripts and questions and prepare for the show, how he was going to run the lead-ins and lead-outs and guest intros was a chore, and while a high priority, he has a lot of things on his plate as is, and rightfully so. This is something that marketing would love to handle, but since they're in the financial technology sector, the marketing team doesn't have the expertise to just run the show without a subject matter expert, i.e. Joe G. So in today's episode, we're going to discuss how they came to a solution, what it was, and most importantly, how it's positively affected their marketing team. I hope you enjoy the show. So Sarah, where I want to start, the first question I have is just, what is it like to prepare a busy executive, a COO, a co-founder to host a podcast episode?
I think it's really exciting. I mean, it's great when you have a co-founder who is all for it, which ours was. It's really just carving out that time in his schedule, making sure that we have the time to prep in advance, that he actually has the time, whether it's not just with us as a team, but him as an individual to go through and make sure that he's familiar with the guest, familiar with just the subject matter that we're talking about. And I would say just giving him that space to make sure that he's prepared.
Let's walk through the way that it would look. So you could even help me to understand how you're going about booking a guest.
Of course.
And then the script development, how are you divvying up that responsibility? Then the actual day of a recording. What does the initial inception of an episode look like through the recording, working with a busy executive?
Oh man, step by step. Well, we have a great team, so there are a lot of other players besides myself that help make it all happen. But from initially, we have a list of speakers that we want to reach out to, and that's really a collaboration between our team, our co-founder who has a great network of hey, these are folks that would be great to have on as guest. From there, I'm reaching out to them, sharing a little background about the podcast. We have a Calendly link that we use for scheduling. I would say that's a great tip as far as just for an efficiency purpose, making sure that hey, if you're working with a busy exec, you have that coordinated and you're not having to go back and forth with scheduling times. So once that's solidified, getting that on the calendar, and then also getting some prep time on the calendar for the executive to go through, make sure he's aware of who the guest is, any sort of content prep he needs to do there. And then also Joe does a great job of really helping drive that narrative, outlining some questions that are both helpful for the guest and then also our executive and host. So I think that's key. And then we also just reserve some an hour of last minute prep the day of. Sometimes he takes it, sometimes he doesn't, but just making sure that he has that block on his calendar, knowing that he's so busy.
Yeah, I'm sure it's a lot of tapping on the shoulder and seeing what you can get to actually have happen. Another question I want to ask, so I want to take a step back a little bit. So we talked about your process, but I want to take a step back. During the initial conversations and the idea of the podcast, and for the audience, we'll refer to Joe Michalowski as Joe and then Joe, the host, as Joe G. How did you land on Joe G being the host of the podcast?
Good question. I mean, we knew we wanted to do a podcast. We have a pretty niche audience. We're speaking to finance leaders at early stage startups generally, or growth stage startups. Joe has that background. So not only is he a co-founder of our company, but he's a finance expert in and of himself. So just knowing that he's going to be able to have that dialogue back and forth with the guest as a subject matter expert. And then also, as we're just starting out on a podcast, we're making ask to other busy professionals in this space. Joe has that background and credibility to be like, hey, he's hosting this podcast, join him, have a great conversation back and forth about something that you're both experts on.
And I'll direct this question to Joe M here. So we've historically talked about rotating hosts potentially when subject matter experts are busy. Is that, and I know you've talked to me a little bit about that and the ideas of doing that. Was there ever any talk of someone else being the host or rotating hosts among leadership?
Yeah, we've spent a lot of time kind of hashing this out because we know that having the subject matter expertise of someone like Joe is sort of the perfect way to get into this space, but we have to balance that with all the time. And so Joe has pushed and said, oh, how can we get Bij involved? So Bij is our CEO, and we have a lot of people at our company with subject matter expertise, and it's like, how can we get everyone involved? And, I think where we landed was that there just needed to be some sort of consistency, so it wasn't just like 1 week we have one host, 1 week we have another one. And I have a background in content, and I do a lot of interviews for written articles. I'd never done a podcast, but being able to sit on the podcast with someone like Joe, being able to rotate in Bij if we want to, and other subject matter experts, at least there's that consistency of, somebody there to sort of keep the thing on the rails while bringing in the subject matter experts who definitely know a lot more about the topics than I ever will, someone who hasn't actually done the work day in and day out.
Yeah, so we've buried the lead a little bit here. So when we started working together, Sarah, you were at one podcast per month, and then you upped to 2 podcasts per month because as a content marketing channel, it was working, at least from what you could see. But while doing that, you also started to feel a little bit of burn on the availability side of your leaders, and understandably so. Doing a podcast is a lot of work, and I want everyone to know that. Even if you use an agency like ours or do it, and even if you do it yourself, either are going to require a lot of work from your marketing team unless you have a huge team, and in that case probably aren't listening to this podcast. So with that, and I got a little bit of taste actually, I speak to Joe and Sarah every single week, and I just got a little bit of a taste of a nugget that's going to get dropped on me here. So what has been some of the changes that you've decided to make, Sarah?
I mean, I think it started with our goal is to scale this podcast, to do it more frequently. Like you said, we're at 2 times per month. I mean, ideally we do this once per week, and that's really our aspirations. But it is really difficult with scheduling and availability to have an executive as a host. So Joe M, just being the content expert that he is, and having that background in interviewing, has really stepped in to support Joe G. As a co-host, and then also more of a moderator. So he's able to do a lot of the prep work that was taking Joe G a lot of time and just taken away from other goals that he had. So he's been able to step in, and then also just more so taking over as more of a host in future episodes is kind of our goal for this. We've realized that although Joe G has that great subject matter expertise, you really just need a great host and someone that can carry the conversation, ask really good questions, and Joe M provides that. So it's been kind of a win-win all around for us.
Yeah, it's super interesting because there are a couple ways to look at it, and I hear this a lot from our customers and just people that I talk to, which is that you need a subject matter expert to be able to talk about complex technologies to be able to keep the conversation going. I do at times argue that point to an extent, in that there are journalists all over the world who report on things that, if you're reporting on life sciences, it doesn't mean that you're a scientist yourself. You're still a journalist who can ask good questions and tell a good story. So I think it's a little bit inspirational, Joe M, that you're able to say, hey, it is this complex technology. Maybe I'm not a fintech expert, but I know how to tell story. I know how to ask questions, and I'll be able to run this show.
Yeah, I really only, when we started this, I cared about 2 things, and it was consistency. We said we wanted to do this, and I was like, we are not going to stop doing this. Like, this is not something that's going to have some sort of like immediate monetary return. Like, maybe it will. Maybe we get a customer right off the bat, and like, that's great. but that's not the expectation. So I just wanted to make sure that we were in a position to keep doing it. Having Sarah, doing all the logistics she talked about is incredibly helpful to do that. So consistency and just showing up and actually getting episodes out. And then the subject matter expertise being part of the podcast. But if that comes from the guest, like that, the focal point should be the guest that comes on. And so, it's great when Joe is there to ask sort of like second and third level questions from his experience to add some color from his background. But any marketer, anyone who's like spent time talking to subject matter experts themselves when they're not in that position, how to like be curious about someone's job. Like you just ask questions about like what their experience is. You can ask follow-ups like, oh, that sounds like it would be really difficult. Like, can you tell me more about the challenges? Like,
Yeah.
The questions don't have to be super difficult. Like, you just let the guests sort of run with all of their great insight. As long as they're the spotlight, I feel like people listening they're not worried about whether it's me asking a question or Joe asking a question. As long as it feels like valuable information, splitting time with Joe really helps make that happen. And, getting to ask some questions, I learn a lot too. So I'm getting better at it as we go.
All right, I want to go back to, because I still do like the idea of you being this moderator before you're moving to full-time host. So after the first episode where it was the two Joes, what was the biggest issue that you saw with serving as a moderator and Joe G as your co-host, co-guest? So what was the biggest issue that you saw, and what changes did you make after the first time that you did it?
Yeah, I was so first of all, I was super nervous to even be doing any of it. And I know Joe is also nervous to do it because Joe and I are not in front of the camera on a recorded line for a podcast kind of people. So out of our comfort zone in both cases. But when we did it together, it's nice that we could support each other. But if I'm asking the questions and moderating, the biggest thing that I thought after that first recording was like, did I ask Joe enough questions? Like, did I give Joe enough space to actually jump into conversations? And I think it's better than it was in my head, but I would sit there and be like, oh, like, I feel like Joe hasn't said anything in a while because I am trying to ask the guest questions, and it becomes like a challenge for the moderator to make sure that there is space for everybody involved to actually like be involved. Because Joe doesn't want to sit there as co-host or as host and, derail what the guest is saying. It's still about the guest. So that was our biggest challenge. And so when we got out of it, it was just Joe and I talked about it. And I would say I'll take a pause like after a guest answers a question and just see like if you're about to jump in, like I'll take a step back. And it's more like a chemistry thing at that point. It's like, can I look at Joe's face on a recording and see that he's about to say something? And that's a work in progress, but it's a challenge for sure.
Maybe it's minutia here, but I'm genuinely curious about this when I go to make this recommendation to other folks, because I was explaining, I've seen this before. Marketing wants to help. They want to push things forward. Subject matter experts are busy. And so you're relying on that. But if marketing is able to, maybe help with the script or help with just getting it ready and then, serve as the host like you were doing, that's great. But my question to you is, when you're setting up the episode, were you viewing Joe as a co-host who's also asking questions to the guest? Or were you viewing Joe G as a co-guest who is also giving answers to questions that you're asking?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I would say pre-episode, Joe is co-host, because Joe and I would talk through the script, see if the questions make sense, see if like the story arc, obviously the podcast goes where it goes once you're on it, but we can structure the question, like the list of questions, in a way that kind of has an arc with the help of motion scripts and things like that. So I would say pre-recording, Joe and I co-host, figuring it out as we go. On the recording, co-guest is probably more appropriate, because the goal of having someone like Joe there, is to give expert input on the questions we are asking the guest. The only difference is that his are usually in follow-ups to what the guest says. And so in that way, it's, towing the line toward host. But yeah, it's definitely, I'll ask Joe, like, what he thinks about what the guest said in a certain way. Like, I'll tee him up to kind of jump in. Or I might know that there's a topic that's really close to Joe's heart, like something that's really important to him. And I'll make sure that when the guest finishes answering, I'm like, oh, Joe has a really interesting thought about this. Like, can you let us know what it is? And then I let them kind of go back and forth. So it's sort of ping pongs back and forth. But on the podcast, I just want Joe to be able to focus on being the subject matter expert. And essentially that's like the guest's role. So probably more in that light than host, I guess.
Yeah, and that's kind of the way that I started to look at it and talk to folks about, is that you're almost having, it's almost like a round table or something where, yes, the external guest is the guest of the show, but your internal subject matter expert is serving more as a parroting voice of what they're talking about with other ideas and what have you, versus a co-host that you both are like the anchors of the show. And as I was going back and listening to episodes of the Roll Forward, that was how I felt like you were more of the host role. It wasn't like Joe M asked 3 questions, Joe G asked 3 questions, Joe M asked 3 questions. It's more like Joe M is coordinating this conversation and moderating it, and then Joe G and the guest are providing their industry insights, which I think does set you up well if Joe G wants to come back for episodes, or other members of your team as you continue to evolve. There will be a lot of opportunities there. Sarah, I wanted to ask you, having marketing have a bigger role within the podcast, how has that impacted the marketing team's efforts with the podcast itself?
Great question. I think it just overall gives us a little bit more flexibility and a little bit more comfortability with hoping to scale and achieve the goals that we had for the podcast. So right now, or previously, we were coordinating with Joe's executive assistant, going back and forth with her, also him as well, trying to figure out what was best. Now it's really just myself and Joe M, and then the guests that we're having on the show. So it's a lot easier just to coordinate between the two of us, and obviously other members on our marketing team, than it is to involve executives or other cross-departmental stakeholders. So I think there's still obviously a lot of work and coordination that goes into it, but just from a logistical standpoint, like it's simplified it quite a bit. And I think it'll be a lot easier for us to do episodes more frequently and just put them out on a more frequent basis.
And were you nervous for marketing to have a bigger role actually on the podcast?
I did have my reservations. I have to be honest about that. I had this vision of us having, obviously, our executive team lead the podcast and continue to scale it to one episode per week, or even more for that matter. But when it comes down to it, they are really, really busy and have a ton of other things that they need to do. So I think we've been able to prove out that this format does work, and it does help us achieve our ultimate goal of just trying to get them out there and get them out faster and get quality guests on the show. So yeah, I feel confident now that we're doing it, but it did take me a little while to get there.
That's a really nice way of saying it. Sarah's really nervous for me to try to interview people. Sarah's like, oh no, I don't know if Joe's going to be able to handle
Not
this.
at all.
I get it. It's fine.
I had full confidence in Joe. I just had this initial vision. And when you have this in your head, it's really hard when things start going a different direction. So it took me a little while to get on board.
I was the nervous one.
He did a great job though.
And I want to follow up on that, Sarah. So you're not alone in that feeling, right? The feeling of imposter syndrome. And I don't mean that, Joe, as you being an imposter in any way, but almost that imposter syndrome of the marketing team. Feeling like we're in this complex technology, and I work with companies that are anywhere from, cybersecurity to life sciences, like very complex solutions where marketing is not as comfortable as where I get to be, right? My show is for B2B marketers. I can talk all day. They call call me a subject matter expert. Thank you to anyone who does. I don't necessarily see myself that way, but other folks do. Great. If I was in this, if I was a director of marketing at a cybersecurity company, I would have that imposter syndrome talking about cybersecurity. I try to tell people, like I said before, if you have the ability to ask good questions and build a story arc, that it's not necessarily about you. So, Sarah, my question to you is, what would you say to another marketer who is dealing with a lot of the similar situations of, marketing wants to move quickly. Executive leadership maybe can't keep up at that same pace because they're so busy. And I'm nervous about marketing taking a bigger lead in the show.
Yeah, I mean, I would say everything that you just mentioned is really spot on. Like you told us that in our weekly meetings as we were going back and forth, like, hey, as long as you have a good narrative, you're asking good questions, you have a good story arc, like that's what really matters. And it rings true. Like I couldn't agree with it more now having gone through it. I would also say too, it's really about the guest. I mean, people are tuning into your podcast or your episodes because they want to hear your actual guest and like their expertise and their insights on this topic. So I would say just continue to have a good lineup of who you want on your actual podcast. Make sure it's people that are really relevant to your audience and have some really interesting things to say. And I think that's what's really moved the needle for us.
And Joe, what's it been like for you? Have you done a solo episode yet?
I did
Yes.
one solo episode. I actually recorded it
right?
yesterday. Yep, yesterday was the first one.
Awesome. So fresh.
Yeah, the thing I was most nervous about, it wasn't like I've asked questions, again, not recorded, but I've done like content calls for expert input for articles that I've written before. Like it's not like interviewing people was that new to me. But I was really nervous that the guest was going to show up and it was going to be like, "Oh, I'm just talking to you." Where's the important person? Where's the person that I actually showed up because they're like the face of your business? And we had a really great chat. So I was much more at ease like as we went through it, but having the green room, like when we use like our recording software, just being able to sit for like 5 minutes, like they don't show up and it's like, "All right, like let's hit record and like let's start it." Just being able to like level set with somebody for a minute and really get to know them and kind of comfort them as well. Cause I mean, guests are always nervous too, unless you're like some super high profile person you get on that does podcasts all the time. We talk to CFOs and finance leaders. Like they're not doing podcasts all the time for the most part. So yeah, just being able to find that comfort zone before you start recording, like it went a lot smoother than I guess it could have in my head. So I was very happy about it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be the first one to tell you, I've done over 300 podcast episodes myself. I speak to you all every week. I get nervous before every episode, whether that's nervous necessarily to talk to you all or just that the content is actually going to be good. It is different when the light on the camera in front of me is on and I know I'm actually recording. It's a different feeling no matter how many interviews you've conducted over how much time. When you serve as the host of the show and you're in marketing, there is just an amazing ability to learn about the space because you get to just ask questions. Maybe you're not a subject matter expert at the time, but you'll notice after 3 episodes, 5 episodes, 10 episodes, 20 episodes, you're almost going to have no choice but to start to have opinions. And whether or not you're, getting in the, on the back end of financial technology, it doesn't really matter. You end up talking to so many people like a journalist covering sports. If you cover enough football games, you're going to have some opinions on football. What's it been like to be able to host a show, ask the questions that you want to ask, and what have you learned to this point?
I learned that I know a lot more about finance than I thought I did. We just brought on at Mosaic, we got a new content writer who I'm very familiar with. We've worked together before. And I guess I've just been writing for I've primarily been doing like our blog and things like that. And so I've had to talk to Joe G over and over and over again about, subject matter expertise issues for blog posts. And bringing on that new writer, it's like, oh, I'm like seeing the learning curve now of like finance. So even just on the first recording by myself, I was like, oh, like maybe I know more about this than I thought I did. And I think that's what you learn as like a marketer talking on a podcast that isn't about marketing, is that, yeah, after like a handful of conversations, like you're going to remember what that guest said 3 weeks ago, and you can bring it to the new conversation. And so, yeah, maybe I haven't sat down and built 1,000 financial models in my time, but I've heard enough CFOs talk about how painful it is to, collect all the data and clean it in a spreadsheet to know that I can bring that to a conversation and they'll like resonate with the problem. So as in like most things for marketer, you probably know more than you think you do. I think marketing, as you said, imposter syndrome, probably pretty common in our line of work, especially if you're not talking to marketers. So I would say you probably just need to push through it, because I'd imagine you know more than you think you do.
I can attest
Go ahead, Sarah.
to Joe being a subject matter expert. I mean, even if he says he isn't, he covers all of our blog content, has done our webinars, is now hosting the podcast. So it's very hard to tell that he doesn't have a background in finance, in my opinion.
Well, thank you. It's very, very flattering.
If you think about it, if let's say, we work together over a year's time, and you're on this, every other week is when the Roll Forward comes out, and you do 24 episodes over the course of a year with CFOs, you likely spoke to more CFOs in that year than 95+% of CFOs. Like, you've networked with more CFOs than any of them have, likely, especially in the times that we're in right now, where networking is even more complex and people aren't going to trade shows and just sitting around and shooting it with each other. I mean, you have this window into the space and into what people are seeing and experiencing. And even if you don't find yourself to be a subject matter expert necessarily, you can still be the person telling that story to the world. So that was what I wanted to talk about a little bit today. I appreciate you both for coming on and really telling the audience that you don't have to be the person building 1,000 financial models to be able to tell stories in the financial space. So with us coming up on our time, Sarah, can you tell us a little bit about where people can go to find you, Joe, Mosaic, and the Roll Forward?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, thanks for having us, Justin. Always a pleasure. For me, you can find me on LinkedIn, just Sarah Street, actually _ So that's probably the best for me. Mosaic, www.mosaic.tech. If you want to shoot us an email, it's info@mosaic.tech. Also, the Roll Forward is on Spotify, or you can also find us on our website too, or LinkedIn.
Awesome.
Joe, do you want to share your info too?
Yeah, Joe, how do people find you?
Yeah, I'm not a big social media person, so LinkedIn, very easy. Joe Michalowski. I'm not going to spell it out here.
It'll be in the show notes.
It'll be in the
Don't
show
worry.
notes. Go
All right,
find it if
great.
you want to find me. And yeah, everything Sarah said about finding Mosaic, but just wanted to say thanks for letting us come and chat. It was fun to actually talk about marketing for a minute instead of finance. It was cool.
Yeah, and it's going to help people. I mean, this is just something, a lot of what we see out there on LinkedIn are marketers who market to marketers. There are more marketers out there who are having to do marketing in other spaces than marketing, and it's talked about way less because it's less sexy, interesting, whatever it may be.
Sure.
But, it's something that so many people need help with, and I appreciate you both, Sarah and Joe, for coming on. It was great having you on Recorded Content.
Cool.
Thanks for having
so
us.
much, Justin.